Now,
All right. So, hello everyone. Welcome to Global Bizapps Day 2020, powered by D365 Champs. I'm Dipesh Sumani. Hope you are doing well and keeping safe. We are into the next session, which is going to be presented by Jim Novak from United States. He's an MVP in the category of business applications and has been working in the Power Platform since Dynamics CRM version 4, almost around the version which I started my journey as well. His work has been primarily focused on building XRM solutions, leveraging the Power Platform to build custom enterprise line of business applications in the US federal space. Today, he'll be talking about advanced liquid templates in Power App portals. Before I hand over the session to Jim Novak, I would like to mention that if you have any questions, please feel free to drop in the chat window and we will take it either during the session if possible or during the Q&A time. Thank you again for joining and enjoy the session and learning. Jim Novak, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen here and let me know when everybody can see it. I have to give a apologize ahead of time as well. We have trick-or-treaters coming in and you may hear some screaming. We have a crazy, scary spider outside and our dog is going a little bit nuts. So if you hear any screaming, it's all in fun. It's not, nobody's getting hurt. It's Halloween here, so everybody's in that mode. So cool. So thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this. It's looks like it's been a great event so far. So thanks for having me on board. We'll get right into it. So talking about advanced liquid templates and Power Apps portals. I'd previously done a session on kind of an overview, an introduction into Power Apps portals, liquid templates, programming, kind of the major concepts and some of the major working pieces. This session, I want to go into a little bit more detail and a little bit more advanced use of those core concepts. We already talked about me. This is just a little bit of contact info about myself, my picture again. But let's get right into the agenda. You'll have that information later on if you want to go ping me on my my website. So what are we going to talk about today? I'll do a real quick recap of liquid templates, basically stealing a few slides from my prior presentation for anybody that's just kind of getting into it, just to give you a couple of the core pieces. And then we'll start diving into some of the more detailed bits. So second, we're going to start talking about working with data collections. When you choose a portal, obviously you're going to be working with data. Otherwise, you'll just be building a static website. Then we'll look at using Fetch XML, which is a really popular tool as part of the liquid template language. From there, we'll look at how to use web templates as a service. If you have to serve up, custom data to your client that you can't really do with a web-based API like the web API provided in CDS, there are ways around that. Then we'll look at some of the template reuse because it's a coding language. We want to reuse stuff. We don't want to copy and paste code. And then there's another concept about extending templates. How do we leverage kind of a foundation and inherit from it, if you want to think in the object-oriented world, inheriting from templates. And then we'll look at kind of pulling it all together, looking at some, complex custom pages or scenarios. I'm going to go through the slides fairly quickly. So again, this is an overview slide, but just generally, I'm going to try to go through the slides fairly quickly. I'll post them after the session's over. Everybody can download them. They're mainly for reference because I want to go and jump into some of the demos and just start looking at some code and mucking around with stuff as opposed to looking at slides. But so we'll go through these pretty quickly. If you have any questions in the middle, please just ping me and we'll try to answer them. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat. And let me make sure I move stuff out of the way. So real quickly, if you're not familiar with the Liquid programming language as part of Power Apps portals, this is right from the website for Liquid where it originated from in Shopify. And there are three really fundamental bits to Liquid, and they're objects, tags, and filters. Objects are how we work with data. An example we can see here is a string for name. Again, that could be a name of anything. Filters allow us to process or transform the data once we have it in an object. And here we see an example of converting it to uppercase, kind of an intuitive transformation there. We want to take the name and we're really excited, so transform it to uppercase. And that's the syntax for it. There's a pipe syntax to chain together filters. And then tags. Tags are the syntax that allow us to control the logical flow and operations. So, and here we're seeing a very simple example of a conditional logic flow with a tag for if. And again, it should be intuitive. Even if you're not a programmer, you should be able to read that and know what's going on. If the name isn't empty, then let's display it in uppercase. So again, some very fundamental bits. These are fundamental pieces to the Liquid language, and they're used throughout the Liquid templating world. So these I want to do a quick recap on if you're not too familiar with them. If you worked with templates before, Liquid templates before, you should be pretty familiar with these. So next up, when do we use them? So why would we ever choose to use Liquid templates? Why not just customize our portal using the tools offered? There's tons and tons of stuff in Power Apps portals that we can configure, and that's one of the really powerful things about the platform, pun intended. Well, you choose to use Liquid whenever you kind of hit a wall, whenever you hit a limit of what the configurable capabilities of the platform are. So I need to go past what I can do with configuration. So some examples here are, I want to add dynamic content. I want to extend the out of the box stuff. I want to add some stuff that I can't just configure, or I'm just going to, provide things that they don't offer. As we mentioned before, we're going to look at how to serve up data from as a service. I'm doing air quotes. And where can we use them? So there's a couple of different places. These are kind of the main places you would really use Liquid templates. First one is web templates. That's the big one where we'll look at those. We'll look at some examples of the out of the box, and we'll build some new ones of our own. You can use them in web forms, entity forms. Those are two bits where we display data from our CDS instance, because under the hood, Power Apps Portals is built on CDS. We can also put it right in the page copy. We're putting a web page together, and we want to put some dynamic content right in our page copy. And then also another example that you can use templates for heavily is in content snippets, which are what they sound like. They're little snippets of language or code that we can reuse in multiple different places. What we're going to focus on are web templates, and that's my one fancy animation for the entire slide deck. So I hope you saw that. It was exciting, I'm sure. So again, if I'm please jump in. I can't really see the chat very well, so please jump in and ask me a question if anything comes up, because again, I know I'm going somewhat quickly here. So right into data collection. So if you're choosing a Power Apps portal, you're typically wanting to display data. Otherwise, again, you can just build your own custom website and put static information out there. And typically you want to display data from your CDS instance on which Power Apps portals is running. You might want to put out, a list of contacts, for example. I want to show to my logged in customers what the list of accounts are. What are my list of cases I have available in the out of the box case management system for customer engagement. And there are two types for working with data lists. So we'll just call them lists in general. But the two types that Power Apps platform offers are arrays and dictionaries. And the distinction between the two, very, very similar in how they operate, but the distinction is arrays are accessible. The elements of an array are accessible by index, while dictionaries offer the elements available by a key. And it's kind of, think of key value pairs if you've done other programming, where I can say that, the ID value of an array is this. A dictionary of a key value of a dictionary is this. Whereas an array, I can say, give me item 7 in the list. Both of them allow iterating over the items using the for tag. And there's a couple of tools for iterating over these lists. So that's pretty much fundamental stuff. But some of the things that pay attention to are, once you iterate over the data, there's some neat things you can check out just to make your life a little bit easier. You have a property called size. So why would I ever even go into a list if it doesn't have any elements in it? So the array and dictionary both give you this property called size. It tells you how many elements are in the list. It might be using that for validation. You might see, a chance I can avoid doing some logic if I don't need to. So things like that is part of the dictionary. Keep an eye on what are offered up with the object itself. The for loop object, whenever you're iterating over the for using the for tag, the for x tag or for item tag, there's a for loop object which gives you a lot of information about what's happening in the loop. It'll tell you the index. It'll give you, I think, a 1-based index. There's a couple of variations in the index. So it tells you where you are while you're iterating. It tells you whether it's the last item in the list. There's a lot of items or a lot of properties on the for loop object that are pretty informative and might help you when you're working on some complex list operating on some complex lists. If you got, a pretty complex collection of items you're iterating over for. in a for loop. And also there's some filters that are really, really helpful. We'll look at an example of these later on when we go into a demo. And I had a really ugly loop. I was iterating over a collection of items, and I think it was a list of speakers or something. And we'll go into a demo site that I built that talks about events like we're doing here. And I had really ugly stuff because I wanted to start a new row in a table, and I built all this stuff to find out about whether I'm at the last item in the index and saving the last and what's the next. And then I found batch, and it saved me an enormous amount of time. So there's a lot of filters out there, a lot of language constructs that really help you with iterating over, complex lists of items, especially if you're trying to reduce round trips and things like that. Group by is another one that came in very handy. And again, the real simple examples over here, we have an array, the property called views on an entity list is an array, and you can retrieve the properties for each individual item in a for loop. Or as you can see on the entity list.views index of 0, the syntax for getting the value of that. This is right out of the help. So I'm stealing it from the documentation. I can get the 0 index item and do something with it if I want to. And then the exact, a little bit different variation on that in a request object, there's a property that is a dictionary called params. And that's what it sounds like on the request object coming in on the URL or being posted to the page. You can look at the parameters and get, the parameter called ID. And we'll look at an example of that. But I can get it by name as opposed to index. So it doesn't matter where it is in the list. I can get to it by a unique key. And then here's an example of checking out the size, like, hey, tell me if I have items in my list. Do you have X number of items in this list? And if not, I can decide not to iterate over it, save myself some processing. So again, pretty fundamental items here. There's some tricks to it, but something to keep an eye out for. Really look at using the data in collections, because this will come in very, very handy whenever we're working on different lists of data that we're going to display to our customers. Next up, related to the dictionary of items or the array of items, we want to be able to go retrieve items using a query. And CDS offers up Fetch XML, and Liquid Templates has support for building our own queries and executing them and bringing back the data to the client, which is pretty cool. I can go out and query things directly to say, hey, go give me a whole bunch of items. The cool thing is it supports a lot of the out-of-the-box stuff with Fetch that you would do in CDS. If you are going in and writing a query with joins, with link entities, it supports that. It'll bring them back with the alias, like you see in a lot of other code, whether it's C# or JavaScript, client-side, JavaScript. And you can parameterize the fetch XML using your liquid variables. For example, if I have I want to make a fetch XML statement dynamic, show me only, and we'll go into an example that show me only the contacts where I'm, the owner, for example, as this contact, I'm related to it, and I can filter by user ID, for example. Lots of other things you can put in, filter by date and time. You can plug in variables right from Fetch, right from Liquid into your Fetch before executing it. So it makes it very dynamic. And as I mentioned, the linked entities and aliases are supported in the return. And again, we'll look at some examples of the fetch here in a minute. We'll build some stuff that hopefully shows this off a little bit more. And what it returns is it basically returns an array of, I believe it's an array of entity records, and each entity record has a dictionary of attribute values, just like whenever you're working with fetch results or retrieve multiple in C# code, you get this, you get an object type entity which has a list of attributes which represents a CDS record. Same thing here. You just get to work with it in the Liquid templating language. And the other really cool thing, and something to keep an eye out for, is when you start working with Fetch, make sure that your entity permissions are available. Because if you start putting fetch in and entity permissions aren't applied, the data won't show, and you'll get really frustrated and start calling CDS names that aren't really very polite. But the cool thing about it is it's applying security. So if you've got security using entity permissions on your data, Fetch XML honors that, and that's pretty important. So it's not going to be a way of just spitting out data to the world from CDS. It's going to honor that entity permission logic, just like in any other part of the system. So it can be a little bit frustrating. So it's a troubleshooting thing, but it's also something that you can rely on for making your website secure. Oh, another concept that we talked about is there's no REST API, there's no web API readily available for querying data in Power Apps portals. They just released the REST endpoint, the web API for Power Apps portals, but I'm 90% sure that it's only for updates right now. I think they want you to rely on querying using Liquid for retrieving data, but I think that'll change. That's why I say for now. So somebody correct me if I'm wrong on that, if it's been released already. But what you can do is you can use web templates in Liquid to serve up data. And again, the cool thing is the security is going to be applied, but you can basically serve up and make it a REST endpoint using a standard web template. They're not restricted to HTML. A lot of times you see Liquid templates rendering web pages, so it's putting out HTML and all the fancy formatting and stuff, building tables or whatnot. Well, you can just serve up data, and you can serve it up in whatever format you want. And I completely learned this, or I'm going to say stole it from Oliver Mander. His approach to it was very simple. It was pretty cool, and I have a link to his blog post at the end of the slides, where it's a real simple, basic set of steps to set up. Basically, you do a new web template. And the result of that web template is whatever format you want, whether it's JSON or XML. You can do comma delimited files if you like, whatever you want it to be. So have the output be whatever format you want it to be based on, whatever you query. On the web template, the bit here that makes the difference is setting the MIME type. So you want to say that you're going to serve up application JSON or application XML, just like you would do in a standard website. And then what you do is you set up a new page through a page template where you serve up, or you bind it to this web template. You say it's a page template of type web template, and you disable the header and footer. Now, what that'll do is that'll remove all the other noise that's going to happen when you typically set up a web page. And then it's going to serve up only the data served up by the web template, and the MIME type is going to be honored. And then from there, you can just call it directly from a URL. And we'll look at an example of this. I got two examples we can look at, in a live system, and it'll make a little bit more sense. But this is a really powerful bit. And where you could use this is a couple of examples is I've got, and we'll look at an example of this. I got a calendar on the page. I built a custom calendar because I didn't like the way the portals calendar worked. Just didn't work for me. Had some issues with serving up stuff. Entity views didn't quite work. So I'm like, forget it. I built my own. It was another post by Colin that I totally stole, and I'm going to totally take credit for it. But got a link for that at the end. But what that relies on is he uses a third-party calendar component, and it relies on JSON data. Cool. So I built a web page that serves up the calendar data. And there's an example of where you would use it. Got another example. We can use it as well for dynamic loading, not just on load of the page. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail later. So like any other programming language, we want to reuse code. I don't want to copy and paste stuff all over the place. That's just bad practice, and you get yelled at by your colleagues and your manager for not being efficient. So we have some methods for doing that in Liquid. And one of them, if you've ever browsed around Liquid templates or the web templates in the just the default out of the box portal, you've seen the include tag, and it kind of does what it says. I mean, it's kind of doing what it describes. It's including a web template. It's including Liquid code typically from a web template in yours. So what I can say is I've got 2 or 3 web templates that do their own little bit of logic, and I can kind of Lego block them together. I forget who gave me that phrase. I can build them together just like I'm working in another language, like with C#, for example, or JavaScript. I'm going to write functions that call out and do a little bit of functionality, give us some information, and get some stuff back, and that's how I build a program. Liquid templates, we've got includes allow us to do that. I can write a really cool bit of Liquid code and use it all over the place if I want to. And again, look at it. We'll browse around some of the default stuff, and you can see it all over the place. But the reason for doing it again is it reduces errors and standardizes, entire segments of your portal. It allows you to, fix things in one place and have it fixed everywhere that references it, which everybody likes because I don't want to fix bugs 5 times over. You can call it as is and just have it do whatever the template does, or you can parameterize it and pass in some flags to have it do different things depending on what the template does. One thing to remember about this, and this is kind of neat, and it's also another potential gotcha, is that the scope is important. And what I mean by that is if I have a variable via an assign tag in a web template, and I name it foo, and I have another web template that has another variable called foo that it assigns a value to, I can overwrite that. And that can be dangerous. It's like in JavaScript, if you have a variable named the same and its global scope, you can overwrite it. That's why we have namespaces and all that fun stuff. So that's a potential risk. You can have weird results if you happen to overwrite things. You include a web template, you overwrite a value in the one that's included, and then the results after it's been included or overwritten, it could be really confusing. Cool thing is we can take advantage of that. We actually can treat web templates like functions, and we'll look at a real simple example of this. Had some trouble dealing with dates, and I found a cool example on how to set up a converted date to a date comparisons, convert it to a number to do a greater than less than. And I wish I could remember, I have the blog post somewhere, I'll post a link to it. And I wrapped it up in a template by itself and allows me to call it and convert a value and just spit it out for later use. And we'll look at an example of this. So it's a risk. You can have weird results if your data starts getting overwritten. You don't know why. Could be a name clash, or we can take advantage of it and knowingly use the same variables inside and outside of web templates. And again, we'll see an example and it might make a little bit more sense. But here you can see some examples of how to call it. You can include page copy. That's one you'll see in a whole bunch of out-of-the-box templates. And what that does is injects the code we see there, the div class, page copy, editable page, all that fancy stuff. That's done one time, defined one time, and it's used all over the place. So if I want to change how the page copy renders, I change it in the web template called page copy. Everywhere it's used, it's updated, and that's a pretty powerful feature. And we'll look at some examples of that once we get into a little bit more of the detail. And the parameters allow you to make your templates a little bit more flexible. I can I can put in some conditional logic and pass off name parameters that my template's aware of. And we'll see some examples of this as well. So it can perform multiple different operations based on what the input is. So that's a really powerful feature here that allows us to reuse code. And again, it's definitely something to get familiar with, and definitely something to take advantage of. You might even write a whole bunch of stuff and then break it apart. And that's what we'll do. We'll look at an example of, you know what, I just need to get this working. I'm going to put together a whole bunch of stuff, and then I'm going to start refactoring it and pull it apart into some includes and some other refactored web templates. We'll look at an example of how to do that. Along with includes, this one's a little bit more abstract, but it can be really powerful. What an include allows you to have a reusable block of code that I can inject pretty much anywhere. What an extending of the template, what a block and an extends tag do is allow you to have sort of a standard layout and allow you to override segments of it using blocks. So basically a block is a named, and I'm just going to read this, a named discrete section in a web template. And you define a start and end for the block. And then what you do is you define your blocks in one web template A, and then you have template B that derives from or extends template A. And I'm only going to override the bits that I care about. So it's really nice. It's kind of like, I think I'm going to get this messed up because it's been a while since I've done some hardcore web-based coding, but like it was like master pages in the old school ASP.NET. So it allows you to have a framework, an overlying like base page, and you're just going to override the bits you care about. So these are really powerful methods for overriding, providing an overarching look and feel for a web page or a series of pages or your entire template, or sorry, your entire portal. And only overriding the bits you care about. But it also can override functionality, or sorry, I keep reading overriding in front of me. It allows you to provide an overarching schema for how things operate together. For example, I had a base set of templates, and what I was doing was, I wish I had a demoable right now. It's just not functioning right now, but I override the navigation, and I use a series of block and extends templates where I overrode which was next and previous because I didn't like how the web form stuff worked out. Once I get that posted, I'll post it on my blog. I'm in the middle of getting it functioning again. So these are another set of really powerful templates for defining some baseline functionality for the rest of your website, and honestly for your team too. Like here's a template, follow the instructions here, fill in the blanks, and override the bits as needed. We'll go through one of the demos, and with the example, we'll go through a somewhat simple example of it, but I think you'll see the capabilities and maybe get some ideas for extending it further. All right, now that we looked at all that stuff, and I know I was talking really fast, it's about 30 minutes in, talking really fast, pulling it all together. The reason we're talking about all these different concepts, and some of them are very familiar. Data entities data objects with collections and fetch XML might be very familiar too. The reason we want to use them all, we want to tie them all together to customize our portal. I might have I have a portal which we'll pull up in a moment, where it's an event portal, and for example, and then we'll jump into this, but I hit a wall with rendering what the event looked like. It just looked horrible. It just looked ugly. I put together a form for my an entity form for my event. I had a bunch of grids, and it just looked terrible. I didn't like how it looked, and it was also just kind of painful to render and put together and manage. So what I did was I started building this portal, and I started using all these concepts, and that's what Liquid allows us to do. It allows us to completely override how our portal operates. We can, and in fact, a lot of the portal out of the box is built on custom or Liquid templates. They're eating their own dog food, I think is the phrase. So a lot of it's built on Liquid already, and we can do our own. We can leverage some existing functionality, like I can call up and render a web template whenever I want. I can redo the entire home page. I can redo an entire page for an event. And some examples, I can just do some very simple custom styling with Bootstrap or other frameworks using Liquid, injecting that wherever I want. I can retrieve a whole bunch of related data, which I'll show you an example of that, for just one page, and it still operates pretty efficiently. I can use includes for a whole bunch of reusable code, and the block and extends, I can define what an entire section of a website should look like. And then if I have some custom client-side components that I want to build, and I just want to have some service calls, which I can build my own sort of REST endpoints using portals. So again, I talked pretty fast. I went through this because I kind of want to get into the demos. I want to go over and start looking at this as opposed to talking about it in slides. So we'll look at some of kind of tying all this together, looking at a complex page. So let me switch over here real quick, and I'll pull up a portal that I have and pull it over on the appropriate screen. So I got a custom portal that we put together. Hopefully you can see that as opposed to my slides. I've got a custom portal, a little bit older template. It's one of the legacy D365 ones, but it should be updated. And I just added some sample pages. This is from my other demo for the simple stuff, and wasn't very creatively named. It's called Simple Sample. It just sounds funny to say too. But I've got, shows off some of the sample login stuff. It actually still works. That's kind of cool. It shows me who I am, shows me a page. This is out of the box configuration stuff. This is a little bit of Liquid. And I've got this list of contacts, and I just throw up, all the contacts in the list. So I have two other things I built using Liquid. I have an entity list built with custom Liquid code. I have a table, a list of contacts that uses an entity list behind the scenes using Liquid. And then I've got an equivalent sample using fetch XML. And all of this is custom, right? So this is a custom fetch XML template, custom web template using fetch XML behind the scenes. And the other one was using the entity list that was tied to the screen. But I built this table myself. So we can take a look at the code real quick. Let me pull up, see if I'm connected to the right instance here. I'm pulling up this amazing tool built by the Uber developer himself, Tanguy, portal code editor. If you're not familiar with it, definitely check it out. If you're doing Liquid code, it's a lifesaver. The UI sometimes gets a little bit clunky and gives you script errors. So I find this saves you a lot of headache. So the entity list sample, if we look at it, this is what we're looking at here. Let me pull it up. The entity list sample does nothing more than has a header. This is a part of the page. You can see it's the page copy. And then this page there's a section in here that I just render out the list of an entity list. So if we look at this, what I'm going to talk about is not really the slides in order. I just want to go through a demo. We're going to have a lot of overlap too. So it's not really going to be in the order the slides are presented. So I apologize, but I think I want to show off a lot of the concepts. I think we'll cover a lot of the concepts here. So the first thing I see, and again, if you're familiar with Liquid templates, this should look familiar to you. If not, what I've got is I've got a web template that I call entity list sample, and it's extending layout one column, which we heard about earlier, and we'll look at that in more detail in a moment. And I've got a block called contact list. It's a custom block that I put into the parent, the web template I'm extending. And all I do here is I have a div, and I have the entity list that I'm pulling from the page, which is configured on the portal. And what that gives me is when it loads, it pulls in the parameters from the page, loads up the entity list, gives me the entity view, which then gives me some data. So this is an example of what we talked about earlier. So we talked about the working with data and collections, and the entity view is an object that has a property called records, and that's a list of entities if they're available. If the view serves up the data, then I'll have a bunch of records here. And what I can do here, and we looked at, working with collections, and that was one of the first things we looked at. I can check to see if the first item in the list, and this is one of the properties I talked about, which is pretty cool, that I can check and see, do I have a first record? I could check the size is greater than 0. Here I just decided to check, is the first record null? And that just, they use nil instead. Or I think the syntax, that would work as well. If I don't have any items in the list, I'm just going to show no contacts available. But we did, so we saw the contacts here, bouncing back and forth. And again, as before, please chime in with questions if you have them. Feel free to interrupt. And what I'm doing here is it's custom HTML. I'm using the Bootstrap, I think grid format, Bootstrap div grid world, which is pretty cool because I don't like tables. They give me headaches. So I built a custom div here, which is rendering a table, and I've got excuse me, a row, and this is the header for the table. You can see over here, full name, company, job title, email, website, public profile. And what I'm doing is I've got this entity list. We can look at it real quick in the portal. Let me just pull up the appropriate page. Pull up the web page. That's where things are defined. And its entity list was the one we were on. Entity list sample. So I have defined on this page. It should be under the localized content. Once again, I'm kind of breezing through this, but I've got an entity list defined in the page, which I think I customized, and I added like one field. This was all set up ahead of time. So the liquid is dependent upon this. It's a convention. I'm going to go see if there's an entity list available. It's going to bring me back a list of active contacts, standard CDS view. It's an entity view bound to a standard CDS view. So that's where this is coming from. That's where this language is saying, hey, go get me the entity list, ID, page, ID, entity list, another object with properties like we talked about. And I'm going to go load that and just go load up an entity list and then render the entity view. So that's where all this comes from. This is another one that is also right out of the documentation. There's the build complex liquid templates, I believe is what it's called. I have a URL for it. Really neat one where it actually recreates the entity view grid like we saw on the main page. So it's a great way to learn. So I stole it. And what it allows me to do here is if I've got records, I'm going to build that row, and I got some simple formatting inline styles. So if you're a style person, don't yell at me. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to iterate. So we talked about this before, and the syntax is a tiny bit different. The minus here between the tags just says don't inject white space. So it's nice for debugging. And I'm just a little bit uptight about that. I try to put it in where I can, but you can see I'm missing a bit. And what I'm going to do is we talked about here, I'm going to iterate on the records collection. I've got an array. I believe it's an array. I don't know if I can access it by the GUID or not, but it's basically just a list of entity records, and on each I can access the properties of that entity record. So that's pretty cool. So very easily I brought up an entity list. Liquid went out, grabbed all the records, and spit it back into this object of type entity view and the property called records, and gave me the collection to work with. That's pretty cool. So now I've got CDS data that is, the security has been applied for, just like I talked about with fetch. All the entity permissions are applied, and now I can iterate and do what I want with that data. And I have to know about what's in the view, of course. It's not super, I could probably get that information from the entity view. And again, that's in the example. There's a lot of stuff there. It's pretty cool. But all I'm going to do here is I'm going to fill out the rows. So what I'm doing is I'm iterating over the rows, and I'm checking the website. And then the scenario was, what if I want to reformat what that looks like on the main page? I want to reformat what that column looks like. A little bit of a kind of a contrived example, but it's basically a link to say, check out my website, as opposed to the URL, which might be kind of ugly. If I look at the simple sample, what they do, an equivalent is same view is shown, and it shows the full URL. And I just wanted to override that as just give me an example. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. So I do a little bit of checking here. I can check the object if I have and I have what's called a capture. It's a complex assign, essentially in my website variable. I'm going to capture the results of HTML that I'm building here, or I don't have a cool website because I don't have a website URL. And you can see it's a property right on that. I've assigned the contact record into a variable called C. So when you're iterating over the collection, that's how you access the individual items in a for loop. So now I have, just like any other language, whether I'm in JavaScript, C#, I can access those properties. JavaScript, you can dynamically do this. C#, you'd have to do the, precompiled, versions, I'm forgetting the name for it now. Kick off the CVS util and you have your strongly typed, sorry, not the loosely typed. And here's one caveat. And when you're working with collections, something to keep in mind, this part gets a little bit confusing and it's not very well documented, but you can see the other ones are easy. I got full name, I've got website URL, got job title. Those are just string attributes. What this is, when I've got a reference, I've got the referent related account is what I'm bringing back. The parent customer ID of the contact is the account, and it's standard CDS stuff. What it brings back is an entity reference. Again, if you've programmed in C#, that should be familiar to you. It's an entity reference is an object that has a name and an identifier. You reference it. The syntax for this is definitely something that's a little bit tricky and it isn't documented very well, but how I'm accessing it here is I'm getting on the contact, I'm getting now this is a dictionary item and it's an attribute, a dictionary of attributes, and that I'm accessing that into an object C, and the indexer in this case is an ID of the attribute, the name of the attribute, and then I'm getting the name property off of it. And that's what goes into the parent customer ID, which should be the company name. So that's one thing to keep an eye out for. Very cool once you can do it. And you can do aliased entities. That part gets really confusing and I can never remember how it works. I have to keep examples around for it, but it's a really powerful thing where I can have a linked entity in Fetch XML and alias like I would and access those extended properties. Like for example, if I want to get the parent customer website, I can grab that. Now I'm back to standard properties and a little bit of conditionals. If I've got an email address, I'm going to reformat it, etc. So that's cool. So this is how I'm in a public profile copy. I'm spitting out on the web page, and I did that all dynamically using Liquid. So I went very quickly through that. It's nothing super fancy. It's not a super complex example, but it shows a couple of things. We're able to access collections of objects using existing Liquid objects. Entity list tag is what we're looking at here, an entity view tag, and we're able to grab those objects and they give us back a collection of items that I can iterate on. Very simple example, but I think you can then see like, oh wow, okay, I've got contact information. Maybe if I want to go out and query for the account information, I can put out all kinds of information about this contact. I can build a profile page if I want to. I can do some really neat stuff, and we'll look at an example in the portal for the events that we were talking about. But very quickly, I mentioned that the entity list and the Fetch XML list are very similar. I mean, and they look almost identical, except for I think one column, the web role versus the public profile copy. So let's take a look at that real quick, and I think that one will go quick because it should be very familiar. So we talked about using fetch, right? And here's an example of it. So we'll look at that very quickly. So we've got a same thing, very similar. I'm extending the layout one column, overriding the contact list. So I'm doing the same thing I did in the entity list, but instead of the data coming from an entity list, I'm just calling fetch. And this is just give me all the contacts in the system to which I have access through entity permissions. So I'm not filtering or doing anything. We'll look at that in a minute. But instead of coming from an entity list, the data is coming from fetch. It's pretty cool. So I can put in whatever parameters I want. And what I did here, the reason I brought up the fetch in this other example on my prior presentation was I'm going to show the role. So here's how I look at the link entity, standard fetch. I use the Fetch XML builder. Jonas will be happy for the shout out to build that fetch, or you can use advanced find. But I wanted to bring back a role if they're related to them. And it only really looks at the first one. We're not going to show all the roles that you're probably part of. And I only think I have like one defined. And these are web roles, right? So it's a contact in portal, so it's a web role. And the rest of it is very similar. In fact, it's identical because I copied and pasted the code, which is what we don't want to do. So I'm rendering the columns. The only difference here is the web role name. If I've got a web role, and here's that syntax I talked about, it's dot syntax. And again, just very confusing to me. So if somebody has a good site documenting this, please let me know because I would gladly pay for it. Here I'm going through the objects just like before, same logic up here. I got the link label, the whole 9 yards, and the email address, the whole conditional here, website. And instead of public profile copy, I'm looking at the web role. If they've got a web role, we're just going to get one of them because that's all I'm looking at right now. I'm not going to iterate on them. And it's web role dot ADX name. So I'm looking at the name property of a web role, and because it's an alias, pardon me, the alias is web role. That's how I access it through the fetch alias syntax. Again, just very confusing to me. And if anybody has good documentation, I'd love to have it. With me, it's usually trial and error, and I keep meaning to write it down, but I don't get to it. So if it's not null, if it's there, then I'm going to put in the web role name for that user. And I think in my demo, I only have me. I have the system administrator role. So it's the only one showing up here. So the reason why I went through this one very quickly is this is annoying, right? So I don't want to have this copied and pasted all over the place. It's almost identical. What I want to do is I want to say, I want to reuse this. I want to reuse this kind of stuff. I want to reuse this iterating on the columns. I want to be able to just basically inject a new data source for where the contact list comes from. That's my ultimate goal. And what we can do here is do includes. We can use extends, and that's what we're going to look at. I hear somebody. Does somebody have a question?
No, we have not any questions, but there is time check. We have 15 minutes left for your session, James.
Sounds good. So thanks for the heads up. I appreciate it. So what I want to do is, and I'll just show you the end result of this. I want to have the ability to just inject a different place for where this data source comes from. So I did that. And what I have is, what I started with was, I created a new template called, not very creatively named, contact table template. And what I'm doing is I'm doing another extends. And what this extends does, and I'll just show you very quickly what this one looks like. What I'm doing is I'm looking at the layout one column, and I've got these blocks that I added. And if I don't fill any information in, the way the extends works is if there's nothing in there, it won't render anything. But I can override those sections and derive templates. So my contact table template, I'm overriding what we show here. And I'm going to override what's in the header. I'm going to override what's in the get contacts. And in fact, I'm not even going to do that yet. I'm going to override what's in the table layout. And you can see already what I've done is I said, I'm going to have a template for each one of those rows. And I'm going to pass in a parameter called contact, which is in the variable C in this loop. And what that looks like, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. What is it called? It's contact table row. Here's what the template looks like. I basically took the logic from both of my templates, put them together into one. All it is the row logic, and it's how I render a row. And where the parameter comes in, I had a parameter named contact, and I'm assigning it to a variable. And the reason I did the underscore C is just to try to keep it unique, but it does the same thing as before. And in fact, it's got both the web role and the public profile copy. If the values are there, it'll render it. If not, it won't. So in my contact table template, I've got all the header information in here, not the most foolproof, not the most thorough, but it allows me to reuse that header, and it's going to show public profile copy if it has it. If it doesn't, it won't show it. And I'm using a template to put that row into one place. It just makes it a little bit easier to read as well. So where I use this, so this is another template. I've got a footer in there, got a header. And where I use this is I'm going to have I'm going to derive from this template. So I can have multiple levels of extends, which is pretty cool. And I just have to have in my layout one column all the blocks downstream. Otherwise, it just won't render. So where I see this is in my new template for the entity list is now I'm deriving from, and I'll zoom in a little bit, same thing. I'm deriving from a new template now, and I'm overriding the block for get contacts, which is just tell me where the data for contacts comes from, and I'm going to assign it to a variable. And with fetch, my fetch XML, I have a template here called current user. So I did two things here. Same idea. I'm deriving from that contact template, overriding where the data comes from, assigning it to a variable, and then the resulting template will iterate on that list of contacts. And how I can just tweak that. And what I want to change to show that is I'll just change what page template is being used. Oh, sorry, I changed what web template is being used in the page template, getting them backwards. And so I just changed this XML contact table. Let me just show the current user. So all this will show me is not all contacts, but you can see I've parameterized it to show only the ones. This is how I can make it dynamic. I can filter and show me only the ones for this user. So I updated that. Let me refresh the cache. Shout out to the podcast let this reload again, and you can see now I've got my header, I've got my footer, and I've got the rendering, which is should be almost identical. I've got my website, web role, all that fun stuff in here. And now it's filtering by only me. So what I can also do is I can change that condition, and I can say very quickly in the fetch XML, you know what? I want to show me all the ones for specific for my, show me all of the ones for my customer. And I'm going to swap out my filter condition. So I can make this a little bit more dynamic, show all of them, or if I've got a parent customer ID, if I've got an account shown, show me only the contacts for my parent company, show me all my colleagues, essentially is what we're saying. Let's see if that refreshes. And we would do the same thing while that's loading. We would do the same thing for the entity list. So now you see I've just changed my filter query. I've got a very, very small template. All of all I'm doing here is deciding what data gets shown. So it's a very simple example, but I think you can see you've got multiple levels of extends. I can keep the logic for rendering in one place, and then I can keep the logic for bringing back the data in another. So again, a little bit of a contrived example, but I think you can see some of the capabilities offered up. So let me switch gears here, and I want to bring up, we talked about bringing it all together and showing a more complex set of liquid templates. So I got an event portal we put together, and it's kind of gone on hold. These are a lot of in-person events, but we're doing some really cool virtual events now, as everybody on this call knows. What I had was, I'll show you a real quick example of the template for the service, because I think that's an important one. I'm going to close that tab. Let me open up the portal code editor for Power Up. And where is it going to be used? What I have, we have an events calendar that pops up, and I didn't like the out of the box. So another Colin Vermander tool, he showed how to use a custom grid third-party component and feed it JSON under the hood. And what I have is, I have a web page, as I mentioned, that, let me just shut this stuff down, get it out of the way. I have a web page, and behind the scenes, this shows JSON. And the template behind it is fairly straightforward. We've got a couple of web pages, and I know I'm bouncing around here. I'm trying to get this in real quick because I think it's pretty cool. We have, I have a web page for that calendar, and here's the events calendar. And if I go to the page for the calendar, this is the web template it uses. So the page template is here. I can drill into it. And I've got a event calendar custom, and you can see what this does. It's a bit of JSON, really not a lot to it. It's a class that has a calendar object, and you can see it's coming from full calendar as a third-party component. Not a whole lot to the UI. It just magically renders when I bring the JSON back. But here's how I'm getting the JSON. I call it from an AJAX request, essentially, or an HTTP request, and the URL is it's empty. And what does that look like? If I go into my portal, let me just duplicate the tab, I can see what it looks like. That's the JSON behind the scenes. That's being served up from a web template that on load of this page, it calls and it'll render the entire calendar. A little bit more data because things have kind of slowed down a little bit. So how does that work? We have a web template I just called it, not very creatively, called JSON. And behind the scenes, it's got fetch XML. We're familiar with that now. It's parameterized. I just haven't implemented the parameters on the front end, but I can filter it by different query parameters, location, start and end. Just haven't put the elements on the user interface. And then all I do is, behind the scenes, the result of this isn't HTML like I was rendering on other pages. It's JSON. It's just going to serve up JSON. And you can see it's just doing the same thing before. I've got my fetch XML element is returning it into, is trying to find it, is feed. Not sure if you can see real well. It's up there at the top. And the feed comes down here, and I'm going to iterate on the items for feed, and on the results entities, I'm going to iterate through. If it's empty, it's just not going to do anything. It's going to return an empty array, so I don't have to put a lot of checking in. And you can see some of the cool formatting we have. We have ISO date formatting. We've got links, and we can do an append, building strings. Lots of cool stuff you can do on the data. And this one here allows me to escape everything else so that it renders fine on the UI. I don't see, the JSON's well formatted when it comes back. So I've got details, and that is coming up over here. So that's what's serving this up. Pretty cool. I got the description, and then the calendar just magically renders it. It's a pretty amazing tool. I got another example of that if I look at an actual event. And let's look at the events list. Here's another example of Liquid. This page, I wanted to put together a list of events, and it just looked horrible if I brought together a bunch of grids. It just wasn't very cool looking. So this is another custom Liquid template that just has a series of fetch XML queries behind the scenes, and I render it however I want. And in this case, I'm using some simple bootstrap accordions, I believe is what they're called. But if I look at one of the events, and I got a bug in my logic there that shouldn't be showing those links. Here's another example of a very complex page that you can do in Liquid. And what I have here is, there's no way I could do this. I tried to do it using an entity form, a web form, and it just looked horrible. So I have a whole bunch of things going on this page. I'll put out some more posts about it soon, but basically I've even got Liquid rendering this. I update the CSS on the page. I'm custom rendering all this stuff from the details of the event record. I've got some related session records that I have some queries bringing stuff back that I render when it loads. And I have a couple different sessions by track. And if you click into one of the, and by the way, all the speakers are coming back. This is custom Liquid, and they're reusable components on what I gave for the cards. I'll show you that in a moment. I got about 5 minutes. Another example of the JSON coming behind the scenes, that's dynamically coming up. I clicked the button, it went out, loaded a very similar page to what we saw before. And the JSON behind that is for a single record. So it's a parameterized record. Go get me the information about this page, or sorry, pardon me, about this session, and spit it into JSON that I dynamically load up through JavaScript. I could have rendered this ahead of time, but I decided to make it dynamic because I didn't want to, I already had enough stuff going on in the page, and it uses standard Bootstrap modal stuff. This is all, there's a couple of components I put together for these cards that I'm reusing. And one of the other things I mentioned, I know I'm talking very fast here, I'm down to the last couple of minutes. If I look at the about page, there's some stuff going on in here that I wanted to show, something to look at with batching that I wanted to show. The About Us page, definitely worth checking into. What this allows me to do is allows me to grab, and again, I know I'm going very quickly here, but there's some links to this in the final slides that I have. Definitely check this out, because what I was iterating on is I had an issue with, I wanted to break after 3. I want to have rows of 3, but I'm iterating just on a collection of these things. And how do I know where I am in a position in an array? The batches do it for me. I had a really ugly loop on this where I was keeping track of what the index was, what's the next one look like, is it null, all kinds of stuff. And then I discovered batches, and it was magic. So what I can do is I have a filter here on the resulting entities from fetch, which we've looked at multiple times now. I have a pre-existing fetch, show me all the sponsors. I've got a role, probably do it in an entity list if I wanted to. And what I'm doing is say, give these to me in batches of 3. So what it allows me to do is I'm going to create a row for each batch of 3. And then I'm looking at my card template, which renders each of these items here, brings in all the profile information about the organizers. They should be some familiar faces, some really cool people. But this allows me to not have to keep track of indexes. And the cool thing is I can just tweak the batch there. That's and it should, if I did it properly. No, I don't want to do 5. That's too much. I want to do 2. And I think I pass it down here as a column count. I had a couple of different places I was mucking with it. So let's see if I can update that and it magically changes for me. Probably have to refresh the cache. The magic, oh, I'm not logged in. Am I going to get lucky with a cache refreshing? No. But as you can see, it's a really, really powerful feature that saved me. I had to refactor a bunch of code, but I was very happy to do it. It's actually really fast. The demo gods are favoring me right now. It's reloading. There we go. So it actually resizes this all. I totally stole this code. There was a really cool article on doing cards and stuff using Bootstrap. Worked out really well. So it's a really simple example of saved me a lot of time. I made it somewhat dynamic, and you can see this is all I'm doing to render this entire page. And there's a lot of cool stuff going on in there and a whole bunch of other templates. So these different tools allow us to kind of make our job more efficient, do some cool stuff in the portal, and make things easier to debug and fix if we ever have issues. So I talked real fast. I'm down to the last minute. couple of, I'll share the slides. I'm not sure if you're going to post them anywhere, but I'll put them on the blog. Additional reading. Here's the liquid templates. Here's liquid templates on Shopify and a couple of people to follow. These are the gurus on portals, and there's my blog. And I put in all the links for the slides. I put it by slide. I started putting links within, but this should give you some places to read. And here's the very last one is the sample site we were looking at. Feel free to poke around if you have any questions about it. I'm trying to document how I built it, but any questions or suggestions would be very, very welcome. And I think I'm right down to the minute.
Yeah, you just finished on the age. Thanks, Jim, for your session. And there was so many new things which we came to know during this session. So, guys, if you have any queries, you can please put it in the chat window, or you can unmute yourself and you can ask.
Yeah, we can do a follow-up. I know you got some, you got Hardy coming up next. Feel free to drop me a line if you have any questions. I'll be glad to follow up. And again, obviously, share some ideas too. I'm always open to learn something. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that will be great, Jim. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for your session. I'll just stop the recording. So we already have